site afterwards, so you can listen again or share with others who might be interested in hearing what we're going to discuss today. As many of you will know, ASFI was established as an organisation in 2021, and it's the peak body for sustainable finance in Australia. We've got a mission to mobilise capital for climate, nature and social outcomes, and we bring the perspectives and power of private capital to solve social and environmental challenges across the public and private sectors. I'm joining this webinar today from the lands of the Wiradjuri, Gundungurra and Darug peoples. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the care and custodianship that elders have had for country, community and culture in these parts for many millennia. This country around Oberon, New South Wales in the Central West is cold high country, an area that was frequented by Aboriginal people only in the warm summer months for hunting, fishing and gathering, well away from the heat of the Sydney plains. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respects to traditional owners from all the lands from which you're all joining. I know we've got people joining from all across Australia today. It's great to see such a lot of interest in this discussion. We've got a large group online, and I know people are still coming in from right across the finance sector and across the Australian government as well. We're convening at a time of global uncertainty. Geopolitical tensions, energy market disruption, and a rapidly evolving policy responses are all creating a more complex operating environment for finance and investment, as well as for governments. But at the same time, the structural drivers of sustainable finance, including the transition to net zero, the management of climate risk, and the search for long-term value all remain firmly in place. Today is a great opportunity to unpack both of those dynamics, bringing in both global perspectives and considering what it all means for Australia in terms of our ability to attract capital and to influence global developments in sustainable finance. I'm really pleased to be joined by three eminent experts in this field, and I'm sure this is the reason why we've had so much interest in this webinar. It's great to have Sean Kidney, who's the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, currently in the right time zone, but a long-term kind of partner and friend of sustainable finance and ASFI. Sean, as many of you know, has been at the forefront of efforts to mobilise global capital for climate action, working closely with investors, issuers and policymakers right around the world. Through climate bonds, he's played a really central role in developing market standards and taxonomies and in driving the growth of investable green assets. Also really pleased to have David Atkin, who was until recently, very recently, the CEO of the Principles for Responsible Investment. He's now returned to Australia, and we're delighted to have David, not just in the right time zone, but also recently joining the ASFI board. So welcome, David. David was formerly the CEO of Cbus Super, as well as other senior leadership roles right across the investment and superannuation sectors. He's got extensive experience leading investment strategy, organisational transformation and long-term value creation across complex stakeholder environments. So great to have David with us today. And of course, Nicole Yazbek-Martin, who's ASFI's Executive Manager for Sustainability Standards and Practice. Many of you will know Nicole for her role leading the development of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy and now also leading its implementation. Nicole's background is in climate sustainability across government, banking, private equity and law. So a stellar panel that we've got with us. The other thing I wanted to mention in terms of introductory remarks, some of you may not be familiar with the term brown bag. It seems to be quite a government kind of way of naming what's a relatively informal event that you can bring your work lunch to. So feel free to munch away while you're listening to the conversation. They're meant to be informative, but also pretty dynamic and informal. So the intention today is very much to get participation from you. We've received some questions in advance, which I'll put to the panel. And you'll also, after I've posed some questions to the panel, have the opportunity to unmute, ask some questions yourself. And please put any questions you've got as we go along in the Q&A function. I will keep an eye on that and pose those to the panel as well. So I might kick off with David and then Sean, but I want to get your take, David, on the current period of really complex geopolitics and energy market disruption. From your vantage point, you've worked with global financial institutions, largely kind of the investment sector across multiple markets. Disruption isn't new, but this volatility is kind of continuing, and would be really interested in how you see those dynamics shaping investment decisions right now. Are they dampening the motivation for sustainable finance? Are they reinforcing it? Is it less black and white than that? You just might need to unmute, David.
Thank you. This shows you I'm a bit rusty. Thanks, Kristy, and delighted to be able to join the team. So I joined the PRI as the CEO just as we were coming out of COVID, and I joked at the time, how much the world had changed and how much, we, as an organisation, we needed to respond to our growing signatory base. PRI, when I joined as the CEO, we were it was coming into peak ESG. And the organisation had doubled in size to less than 2,500 to over 5,000 in 4 years, from 2019 to 2023. But every 6 months, it seems like there's some major shock or some major major development that was really challenging not just the politics of the world and geopolitics, but how investors were having to navigate. So obviously we had Ukraine war, cost of living crisis, inflation, et cetera, and now recently what's going on in the Middle East. So, and in a way, a point about peak ESG is the narrative that I certainly, when I'm reading mainstream media, is that sustainable investors are walking away from sustainable finance and governments are losing appetite to regulate around creating the right enabling conditions for climate, for example. Now, neither of those things are true. In fact, is the opposite. But it is dependent upon where you are globally. The investors do respond to these issues differently. So, for example, in Europe, obviously with the Ukraine war, you've got much more sensitivity to the need to focus on energy security, although that's now kind of more of a global thing. So the debates amongst investors is around responsible investment in defence, for example. It's been a major topic of discussion. I think we're seeing, increasing. We've seen a doubling of the amount. More than double the amount of funding is going into the energy transition for renewables compared to fossil fuels over the last 12 months, 1.1 to 2.1, and that is accelerating. And I think what's happened in the Middle East will further accelerate the transition, the energy transition that is occurring globally. And the energy transition, I think, in a way, is going to drive the change process in a way that's not properly understood by all of us. But we are seeing economics drive the change process, because if you are having to think about, first of all, in terms of your climate obligations, but then if you're thinking about energy security for your nation, then renewables becomes quite compelling. The economics of introducing renewables. We're also in a world where energy is now not stable. Sorry, it's not a steady state. We've now got increasing needs of consumers around the world to access energy, whether it's in developed markets or developing markets. With the introduction of AI and data centers, it's another element that's going to drive the need for acceleration of the energy transition. So yes, you're seeing what's happening in the US, pushback from the anti-ESG forces, but that's even not stopping the renewable change process. I mean, people might be surprised, but Texas is the biggest renewable state in the country. You've got some of the most progressive climate disclosure laws in California. In Europe, there is a rebasing based on what's happening in the Ukraine war, but we're now seeing the regulations being sort of adapted. We're seeing in Latin America strong sustainable finance policy being set by governments like Brazil and Colombia. And then in Southeast Asia, or Asia more generally, I think that's the most exciting area. I think it's less political, it's very pragmatic, it's all about let's find solutions, and it's not politicized. People recognize there's a problem. And I think what's happened in the Middle East is really only going to accelerate, but I'm sure others will have some further thoughts on that question, Kristy.
Very much, David. What about you, Sean? How are you seeing those dynamics shape investment decisions right now?
Oh, David did right. Of course, he's always right. but I would just add a little bit more to it. We put out an April Fool's press release saying that the Nobel Prize had a new climate action award that had been given to Donald Trump for services to dramatically boosting renewable energy around the world. If you were in a consumer nation in the last 4 weeks, or a nation that starts with this current account deficit problems in the last 4 weeks, you are looking very, very hard, very quickly at clean energy. Now, if you're willing to buy kit from China, you can build clean energy very fast. Big solar farms in 6 months will be up and running. Gas is going to take you years and years and years because the backlogs, if you can get the gas. You know, we still have airlines in Southeast Asia and in other countries rationing their aviation fuel at the moment. So that's why flights are so expensive and flights have been reduced. Air New Zealand, I think, has dropped 1,000 flights, for example, from its program because of lack of aviation fuel. These are really critical issues. What we're entering into is the age of fossil fuel volatility, which is linked and tied to the age of climate volatility. Volatility is the new norm. If you can get away from volatility, that's what a 30-year solar plant gives you, by the way, then you're going to be looking at it right now. And there's no doubt that David did right when he says the number of decisions that are being made now around solar plants, wind farms, and most importantly, because it's the biggest bottleneck, grid connections and transmission lines all around the world to facilitate that, has just gone crazy in the next few months. Now, if you want to look for an investment in grids and companies that produce cable and grids and transmission lines, now's the time to do it. It was already hot because of data centers, and it's going to get hotter in the near future sort of market, but also clean energy plants and so on. And Australia's in a bit different position because it's a producer as well as a consumer. You know, as you know, it doesn't have some fossil fuel assets, it has other fossil fuel assets and so on. You don't see quite the same tension. Although I'm going to tell you, driving down to the Snowy Mountains last week with my friends in a hybrid car, they were looking at every station, looking at what the price is. And they're telling me stories of friends who have decided to suddenly buy an electric vehicle. It's happening here too at a personal level. So that's really what's going on. From investors, a friend of mine at Goldman Sachs Asset Management said to me last week that their clients are now saying in the thematic market, but in more general, they want sovereign issuance and sovereign thematic bond issuance to tell a story about how the country is becoming more resilient to shocks, i.e. the example of the fossil fuel shock of the last 4 weeks. And by the way, they're becoming aware there's a lot more shocks coming through the system. So how do you improve resilience? And at Climate Bonds, as you know, we're doing a little work on a Climate Bonds resilience taxonomy to guide investors in that way. And our latest supporter is Nippon Life in Japan, who's become a big supporter of this program. There's more and more investors considering the full ramifications of resilience, including, and perhaps most importantly for the last 4 weeks, security. China built its renewable energy industry and its electric vehicle industry primarily, not only, but primarily for security reasons, because they knew the Seventh Fleet could blockade the Straits of Malacca at any moment. Japan is waking up to the fact that most of its 83% of its energy is fossil fuel, comes through the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. Security is something we're really talking about globally and is top of the pops in Europe, where while we switched from Russian gas to US and Qatari gas, we survived the last couple of years. Oh, but we just realized, US and Qatari gas, that's a little bit problematic too. So the push to rapidly grow renewables to speed up that whole agenda now, which the Commission's been very supportive of, is well and truly underway there too. And basically every consumer nation is going to speed up all those programs. Australia has the opportunity to be a quality supplier of fossil fuels while we're phasing out. I don't think the gas industry is going to go bankrupt in Australia in the short term, but there is no doubt now that the phase out has begun. It's just a matter of time.
Thanks, Sean. And both of you, I think, in your answers have mentioned this ongoing volatility, the importance of resilience. Keen to hear if you think that or other things will shape global sustainable finance markets in the next 5 to 10 years. What do you think is going to drive that? Might stick with you first, Sean, and then go back to David.
Well, we've been in the habit recently of trying to prove that there is no difference between green, sustainable, and resilience. I guess our coup de grace in November last year was the Tokyo Metropolitan Government's resilience bond that was 7 times over in the London market, 7 times oversubscribed, 5 basis points greenium, lower price than normal Tokyo bonds. The same as any green and sustainable bond. We now see a race amongst many parts, especially governments, to expand their green bond portfolios or climate bond portfolios to include resilience. We've already seen Brazil do something in this area. So we expect issuance in the thematic market to substantially grow because the main cap with existing issuers, particularly sovereigns in the last couple of years, has been the lack of eligible assets. And we're now saying, there's a whole lot of other stuff that does qualify here. You've still got to make sure it meets certain rules, but there's a lot more, health investments that address pandemic risk, for example, social investments that improve inequality, which is a predictor of economic resilience. All these sort of things become. So yes, we expect growth. Someone said to me a couple of days ago, look, we're about to hit $7 trillion outstanding in the thematic market, US that is. And they said, it's becoming mainstream now, normal, isn't it? I said, yes, that's true. And that's, of course, the objective. We want all issuance to take into account future risk, as it should, over a reasonable time. But the thematic market is still proving resilient and useful, and that's shown by the differential levels of subscription. And that's going to continue to happen for the next few years. In China last year, green bonds grew 50% overall in the previous market. Flat in Europe, down 40% in the US, for reasons we all know. But Asia currently is booming. That includes transition bonds and resilience bonds, which are beginning to pop up. So and that applies, by the way, also to loan markets. So we've seen in China, there are 10 times as many sustainable loans as there are green loans. That applies to multiple countries, including Australia. In fact, this is beginning to infuse all asset classes. In India, we'll be launching at the National Stock Exchange soon green equity principles, because they've told me that last year, 23% of all IPOs on the NSE were green, qualifying it, and they want to grow that. That's a movement happening in Singapore and Brazil and other parts too. This is not slow. There's no slowdown. There's just a slowdown in anyone who's in the shadow of Trump.
Excellent. And what about David, from your perspective?
Yeah, so could you repeat the question again, Kristy?
So it's sort of both of you talked about ongoing volatility and resilience being kind of a strong driver of continued interest and growth in sustainable finance markets. I'm keen to hear what you think will drive action and growth in the next 5 to 10 years, taking a long-term kind of lens.
Yeah, so just picking that up, I guess this is particularly coming from a PRI membership perspective, where asset owners were the ones who set up the PRI. Asset owners are pension funds, insurers, endowments, sovereign funds, sovereign wealth funds. And their time horizon for value creation is multi-generational, which means that they need to be thinking about short, medium, and long term. But in particular, they need to be thinking about risks that are coming down the runway and the way in which they can protect their portfolios, but also take advantage of the thematics that are flowing out of the volatility. So I think, however, they do have their risk return objectives that are fiduciary responsibilities. And so, they have to be very thoughtful and careful about when they're assessing risk. So this is why, for example, the data that underlies decision-making in investments is so important, that there is credibility to that data. We've not been operating in a world where investors have had the information at their disposal around sustainability risks to be properly informed historically. That is changing. We've got 60% of the world's GDP that have now signed up to introducing ASFI standards. So you're going to start very soon seeing investors being able to compare apples with apples within industry, within countries, around sustainability criteria. In addition, and Sean will have much more to say about this and has been a key driver, I think there are 60 countries now that are in the process of introducing taxonomies. Now, again, that's a really critical enabler for investors to be able to properly assess an asset in terms of its green credentials. So these are really important elements that we are now seeing come into play that I think starts to help investors. However, asset owners, I think, are increasingly becoming aware that they are dealing with systemic risk and risk that they cannot diversify away, which therefore means they're having to think more actively about their role working with other investors in how you address systemic risk. And that's where, particularly the interplay between public and private becomes so important, and the policy environment that will protect investors from creating value over the long term. So this is why things that Sean was talking about is so important. Governments understanding institutional investors' perspectives, and if they're wanting their capital to play its role, then they have got to provide the right conditions, the right policy conditions to enable that. We'll talk about that, no doubt, further in the conversation. But I would say that I think, in a way, the last 4 to 6 weeks is going to accelerate even further the anxiety, but also, I think, the obligation for investors to see what they can do working on their own, but also with other like-minded investors. And this is where asset owners have got a really important role to play, because they're the ones who, at the top of the capital tree, they're allocating the mandates, and in the way in which they set those mandates up sends a very important signal to the market. And I think there's more that the asset owner community can do to be consistent in the way they set that signalling. But I think there's a growing recognition amongst that group of our PRI signatories about the criticality of engaging around policy to create the right enabling environment.
Which is an excellent segue, I guess, to bring in Nicole, who's been very deeply involved in Australia's sustainable finance agenda, as well as working with counterparts across the world. And the sustainable finance agenda in Australia has very much been a partnership and a collaboration between the private sector and government and government policy. Nicole, we now have moved into sort of the implementation phase of the taxonomy. The taxonomy was released in June last year, and you've led an implementation pilot over the last 9 months with 11 financial institutions. Keen to hear from you how the market's using or thinking about using the taxonomy to inform financial decision making.
Thanks, Kristy. And I think both the comments from Sean and David have really kind of set the backdrop for the use of these tools and the implementation to try and decipher and chart a way forward in terms of decision useful information to navigate both climate risk and opportunity. I think Sean's right, volatility is the new normal, and therefore we do need to be looking at like what are the underlying currents that are driving not just the waves that are splashing around in our faces. And so if we take a step back and think about the theory of change, the trio for effective decision making, which is your disclosures, which are there to help identify the risk and the opportunity, the transition planning, which is how are you going to now, what are you going to do with that, and how are you going to do that, and then taxonomies, which is the what, where you're going to be allocating capital towards, what Sean likes to call the shopping list for the future. That ecosystem of information is what is needed to actually start to think about how do we effectively allocate capital that is aligned to the underlying current of where things are going, and see through the short-term noise or the short-term waves that are splashing through our faces. And so what we've really started to see with the financial institutions is that they are inherently looking at it as a normative benchmark in terms of that this is what a future state of assets across key sectors of the Australian economy based on the Australian energy transition needs to look like. And that benchmark can then be used in a number of direct and indirect ways. So I think a lot of time we do focus on the direct ways. They are the visible ways, and Sean's talked a lot about the thematics in the bond market, and that's sort of like a clear signaling, and it's very helpful. But it's actually in a lot of the indirect ways that you're going to start to see the taxonomy be used alongside these other tools to help with capital allocation decisions. So we've been working with some investors who are really starting to use it to support them in their due diligence processes, which has been a very, very helpful benchmark for them to start to assess particularly that defences portfolio or the bond portfolio. So starting to really get a handle on the quality and veracity of that. And of course, starting to look at their real assets, not necessarily in terms of climate solutions. So sometimes they can meet that benchmark, sometimes they can't, but start to get an understanding about where their assets sit relative to the taxonomy. So, you know, like I said, we are seeing that uptick in bonds, but importantly, to what Sean said, we're also starting to see taxonomy be used to underpin loans. And I think that that's a really exciting part of the market, because really if you can create and structure loans that enable the flow of capital through to the real economy to help them and support them with their capex needs, to help them to transition, that's when you're really starting to get flow through into the real economy. We're also seeing that link between transition plans and taxonomy, that forward-looking capex, tracking that over time, particularly in key areas that are very hypersensitive to the transition and to the volatility that we've been speaking about is a helpful connection. And so we actually see it playing a important and informative role in terms of stewardship going forward. Again, not necessarily in that outward facing role, but in that inward decision making role. And of course, to supplement the methodologies to build around climate solutions. To Sean's point, the more that you can actually incorporate these thematics and create the frameworks, credible frameworks to support the investable universe, to support financial institutions, to make capital allocation, not just towards our net zero transition, but to think about broader resilience. You're going to build that information ecosystem such that it will help with broader decision making. But I think to David's point, there are systematic risks in the system, and so we do have to be working together. I think one of the key things and success of things like taxonomies and the frameworks that are built around them is that when we're able to get consistent information, you can better track where things are going within the economy that can help inform better policy making. So we know at the moment that finance emissions is very much a lagging indicator of sort of what's happening. It is a product of how the real economy can perform at a particular point in time. We need to get better, and if we can start to embed these information systems in place, we can start to see sort of where portfolio capital is going, capital allocation is going, and start to track better leading indicators, start to see where they are not tracking and where policy needs to step in the void. So I think we've only just started to touch on the utility of these tools, and the better we're able to utilize them and the more we're able to grow them and make them more encompassing for the needs of what we're seeing in front of us, I think the better we'll be able to manage individual investment risk, but also to inform government policy to manage systematic risk.
And Nicole, what do you think is the most impactful of the range of different use cases that you just talked about then?
So I think if we can really start to think about using taxonomies to track capital allocation, so that forward-looking indicator around capex, that is going to give us a really good indication of what the next 5 years are going to go, right? Investments made today are going to flow through into the emissions profile of the real economy in 3, 5, 7 years time, and or not, right? We're going to start to see where those shortfalls are coming through into the market. But you know, if we're looking and tracking capital investments in the renewable energy transition, that's an excellent indicator of where our sovereign energy security is going to be sitting in the next 5 years. So I think that, you know, that link between capex and progress and capital allocation and progress is really key. And taxonomies are very useful where their coverage is broad to be able to track that in a consistent way and also use that as a benchmark relative. Look, this is where we need to be, but this is not where the economy is at the moment. That in itself provides really useful information to help inform policy and to inform investment decisions.
And we've, in a number of different forums, had a lot of interest from across the finance sector and from government on how to support broader uptake of the taxonomy. We've had one particular question put in on this from Yuri Smith, who's interested in the panel's views on whether Australia should adopt a mandatory requirement to report its green asset ratio aligned to the EU as a KPI for banks and investors to measure taxonomy adoption and actual progress towards net zero, exactly sort of what you were just talking about, Nicole. I might start with you, Nicole, and then Sean. I'm sure you'll have something to say, and David, you're very welcome to jump into, but let's start with Nicole.
So, I mean, I think, you know, I don't think we're operating in a world where mandatory, you know, green asset ratios is something that could happen in the immediate term. And I think we have to be very realistic about where the industry is at today, the data flows that are available, the coverage, both of the taxonomy as well as sort of, you know, broader pieces of information. I think it's an aspiration, and I think getting standardized around these things is really, really important. And I think there's a lot that we can do to support both the flows of information as well as, you know, I think a lot of people will get chills down their spine when they talk about green asset ratios in the way it was originally envisaged and implemented within the European system. I mean, yes, they went first, but there was a lot of problems and technical complexity with that. So I think we need to create simplified mechanisms. You know, let's just start with a simple green loan ratio, which is, I think, something that many in Asia are looking at. I know in some jurisdictions within China, mainland China, they're already starting to do that within that jurisdiction and tracking just the lending of green relative to their books, and are using that as very helpful information. So I think creating the mechanisms to be able to have simplified, decision useful ratios, and enabling that financial institutions and others to start to use that in the first instance, encouraging them to use it as part of their disclosure suite, I think is probably the way that we would want to go in the first instance. We don't want to make this a compliance exercise. We want to ensure that it is decision useful for participants. But others might have other views.
As much as I love EY and Deloitte and KPMG, I don't really want them to grow vast businesses helping organisations with compliance, which is what happened in the EU. Mea culpa, I was involved in designing all that process. The green asset ratio turned out to be a mess in implementation. It wasn't done right up front, and it's being reformed at the moment. But the more general point about how do we track allocations to future fit investments as distinct from old world investments, that's a useful metric. That's a useful thing to do. So the principle is absolutely right. And if we understand it like that, you know, what the taxonomy represents is a future fit universe. I mean, we've got more work to do. We've got to identify what works in different areas and so on. But we currently cover about 80% of the economy in the taxonomy. We now need to look at expenditures, particularly government expenditures, to make our society and economy more resilient, which is the next stage of it. But it's a work in progress, and it'll keep going, but it's useful. It's a guidance. It's a signpost. It's a signpost for the future. So for that reason, having a sense of reporting about how people are going on shifting their investments to a more resilient and a more future fit portfolio is useful. Another important data point for investors going forward. And, you know, in the comment that's happening at the moment as a result of the troubles, let's face it, the war against Iran, we're seeing investors say, how is sovereign issuance consistent with being better able to survive those sort of shocks going forward? Taxonomy is part of that understanding of the sort of things that are relevant, especially once we start building out the economic and social aspects to that taxonomy. So that's the period we're in. I would say that for investors, a critical thing to ask, which is being asked in many markets of the world, is how are governments managing future risk? It's as simple as that, right? It's as crude as that. Some of that risk, as the Network for the Greening Financial System, central banks have made very clear, is around stranded assets as a result of policy change, what China's doing, what the Europeans are doing, how that washes through the world. That's part of what we're seeing at the moment, especially the reduced cost of solar driving changes in energy markets. 93% of all global capex and electricity generation last year was in clean energy, folks. Hey, game over. If you haven't factored that into your portfolio, you're missing a trick, as an example. But there are many other aspects that we need governments to start thinking about. Are they prepared for the next pandemic, which has been guaranteed effectively by our climate scientists going to come, and so on? Are we making sure that our societies are strong enough to deal with severe bushfires, floods, pandemics, and so on? Do we have rainy day funds? These are indicators of lower default risk going forward. And that's the taxonomy helps us come up with a universe, a menu of things to look at to start thinking about prospects for lower default risk. Some of this has been brought into the credit rating agency, and I note that my friend Brian Kyle from Moody's is on the call, who's done a fantastic job of bringing in within Moody's physical climate risk data points. I mean, they've still got to get to the other data points yet, but the same thing's been happening at S&P and Fitch's, because these are real and material indicators of improved likelihood of returns going forward or lower likelihoods. And yeah, the taxonomy is your first clue.
David, do you want to come in on that before I move to the next?
But perhaps also, because I mean, it might respond to a question that's coming, but I think it's sort of complementary to what Nicole and Sean were saying. From an Australian perspective, from an investment market and policy perspective, I mean, one of the things the PRI has been doing over the last 4 years is running a program, sovereign engagement, where we've brought investors internationally and locally into the room with policymakers as an educative process. And that's really helped us inform each other better about how we think about our roles as policymakers and investors. And so with that in mind, we can see, for example, that Australia has definitely emerged. I mean, I can say as an Australian, 10 years ago, it was an embarrassment to be walking around internationally in terms of our climate policy, whereas now we are seen as having credibility. We've legislated targets, we've got sector plans and national strategies in place that all tell investors, capital markets, that a signal that we're beginning to take these things seriously, and that is real, because we've got tax incentives in place, co-investment vehicles, and other investment incentives that helps Australia compete with Asia and other markets. We've got our mandatory climate risk disclosures, as we talked about, a credible taxonomy. We're issuing sovereign green bonds for the first time. These are all important signals. But from a future focus point of view, I think there is more that can still be done. Investors are saying that they're looking for more detailed plans from Australia to implement and finance its nationally determined contributions. For example, a comprehensive NDC investment plan that details the scale and timing of capital required to achieve its targets, and the types of finance it'll seek to leverage to get there would help operationalise the national transition plans and sector pathways. They're also looking for a revised national adaptation plan that gives certainty on how measures to address the country's growing exposure to physical risk will be embedded in industrial and planning regulations, and what finance strategies will be developed to help fund the inevitable asset and community protection that is required. And at a minimum, adding an adaptation to the Australian taxonomy would be a positive step in our mind. And then finally, I think what we need is a more credible and transparent price signal in the market to unlock greater capex commitments from companies to protect their long-term viability and to accelerate the energy asset switch. And finally, the promised review of the safeguard mechanism is a critical opportunity, we think, for this to occur and shouldn't be delayed in our view. So there's just some thoughts to contextualise it from an investor's perspective about Australia, kind of a bit of a scorecard of what we think's been achieved, which is positive, but more to do in our minds.
Thanks, David. That's very helpful, and particularly given the PRI has this global kind of bird's eye view of many jurisdictions, and have, investors don't allocate just to one country. They are global allocators, and so are comparing these settings across countries.
To that point, I mean, in a way, those countries that have the best story to tell will be, in terms of their energy transition, will be the ones that are advantaged going forward. So, I mean, I think this is why, it shouldn't be a race to the bottom, it should be a race to the top. And we've certainly seen that dynamic where countries have, example, 3 years ago when we had our PRI in person in Japan, the Japanese government were very conscious that their credibility in the sustainable finance world was not as they would have liked. And they wanted to be able to address that. So they used our conference where we had international investors coming around the world to tell a new story of real progress. And they listened, they did a major outreach trying to understand what institutional investors were looking for. And what they have said, they have done. They've got more to do, no doubt. But they wanted to be able to say, come and invest in our transition. So I think the more countries understand that it's a competitive process, I think will also be a further sort of crystallised momentum.
Yeah, I think and that's a good segue into what I'm keen to get all of your views on, which is Australia's role and influence. So you mentioned kind of the range of progress that has happened already in Australia, David. Where should we be taking what we've done well domestically internationally? What role should we be playing to drive global progress? And I might start with you, David, and then Sean and Nicole.
Yeah, well, I think we've got a great set of cards at our disposal, but we can't assume that it's just going to happen. I think that there is, and also we need to recognise that we are dealing with systemic risk that is existential. So therefore, we've got to think about not only our own context, but we've got to think about the context of the world of other countries that that are in our world. And to that point, in a way, I'm less concerned about capital. There's enough capital to enable developed markets to make their transition. It's in emerging and developing economies where we really need to get a stronger signal coming from institutional investors, which is not there yet. There's more work for us to do, and there's lots of reasons why investors don't invest in those markets for legitimate and some, in my view, sort of conservative or ignorant reasons. So I think Australia, in a way, has got an opportunity as a middle power, as someone who's connected to particularly this region. It should be investing in the Southeast Asian global geopolitics to understand the needs of those markets and how we can play a supporting role, how we can have our mature finance markets play more of a role in creating solutions. So I think that's a start in terms of the role we can. But the bottom line is we are now seen as credible players who is worthwhile listening to, and that was not the case 10 years ago. So I think we're in a much better place as a result of all the work of the people on this call over the last few years.
I'd frame it in two levels, Kristy. First is we're in a world where we have a lot of competing power blocks. We've got a triumph of short-termism over long-termism. That's a tragedy of climate change. But we have one big opportunity, something we've done in the last 70, 80 years, is we've created pools of capital around the world in select countries which have long-term mandates by fiduciary duty, by legal requirement. They have to pay their pensions in 40 years' time or whatever. This is an opportunity for us because suddenly we have a power block, if you like, $130 trillion of institutional capital around the world, with Australia being a big chunk of that, that has a mandate to look long-term at exactly the time we are caught up in short-term pressures. This is really important. The future of capital is to properly carry through its fiduciary obligations and understand what it can do, which it hasn't been doing as well as it can. Working together is the key, as we talked about earlier, where capital collaborates, it can lead to big change. And already some big funds, like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, that's got a 100-year mandate, are absolutely excruciatingly aware of this in their work. Well, anyone who's a universal owner, a large investor, say more than $100 billion of US asset management, is in this space. And the engagement with government is the critical way to make this happen. What we need to do, and this is something Australia also as a country can do, is to look at how we create rising tide economics. Universal owners depend on a rising tide. They do not depend on stock picking. We need to be thinking about how we improved a lot of our global economy in the context of the challenges we face, and how we influence governments to adopt policies that will be beneficial for their citizens and their voters, for that matter. And this is an economically sensible policy for people. And that's where I think investors have a lot of role to play, but middle powers that have been reasonably successful and a rising tide. I mean, I'm thinking about Australia, I'm thinking about Canada, I'm thinking about Japan, I'm thinking about Korea, the UK, I'm thinking about Singapore. We've just signed a trade agreement. These are countries that want to work together, that are now looking and understand that there are some big elephants in the room, the US, China, etc. We need to band together anyway to be able to be stronger, but we need to band together to promote the right kinds of policy behaviours that will lead to a rising tide, normalise and share those around the world. And that's what I see as the next 5 years for Australia and its friends.
Long-term economic partnerships across kind of this coalition of middle powers. I think that's something that has a variety of kind of benefits, sort of economic long-term productivity, resilience, a whole range of economic security. Nicole, what about your views?
So I think kind of drawing on both what David and Sean said, taking it down a little bit more into the practical and the how. And, you know, we're really focused on sort of the success of the cake is in the cooking, and then so that we can all do the eating. What we have done well, I think, is that collaboration between the private sector and the public sector in this space of shaping the sustainable finance agenda. And that, I think, has made us better for it and better prepared. We have a lot more buy-in instead of it being a top-down approach, but having government at the party together with the finance sector working on these collective solutions, I think, has put us in good stead. How do we continue to work together? To Sean's point, the massive outsized role that our institutional capital organisations have, the strength of our banking sector, both in Australia, but can, I think, push out into the region, to work with government to say, okay, how do we support our neighbours to both shore up the future demand, because these are our future demand. You know, we're on the doorstep of Southeast Asia, which will also be the future demand for Australia's prosperity. And doing it in a way, in that collaborative way between public and private, so that it actually, the solutions that are created as part of that enable capital to flow at the speed and the scale required. So I think it's that, can we bottle up that collaboration that everyone has been talking to in a bottle, that Australia's been able to do relatively well, double down on that to really work together for those collective solutions that we can then export out, and to create something that enables that private capital to flow into our region as well, so that we can grow our region in a way that is lifting the tide, that lifts all the boats, that supports institutional capital going forward.
So, Kristy, just to jump in here, just to also make the point, notwithstanding the great progress that has been made, and that there is a genuine culture of listening and learning here in Australia, and collaboration across, parties. But I would say that there's still more we could do. I mean, if I look at some of the Southeast Asian countries, the way in which they're very pragmatic. It's all about dealing with the issues of the day. The politics kind of gets filtered out pretty quickly. But I've loved the way the regulators have brought investors into the room and say, right, we've got this problem. Okay, let's find solutions for it. Let's work it together. So yes, enforcement. So I guess the point about that is enforcement of regulation is really important. And greenwashing, for example, has been a major concern, that we need to make sure that, what you say you do, you can verify with evidence. However, I think we've got to make sure we create space to innovate. And I do worry that we're in an environment where we're being constrained from being able to innovate, because there is concern about falling foul of regulation. So getting the balance right there is really important. And I think there's some lessons to be learned from some of our Southeast Asian neighbours on this question.
Thanks, David. Yeah, that's very much sort of a two-way exchange, learning and partnership, I think. We'll move into audience questions. If anyone else has got questions that you haven't yet put in the chat, please do. We've got a couple that we'll get started with. The first one from Apana Giratharan, and Sean, I might put this to you, which it's building on the comment that you made about these middle powers and collaboration between middle powers. The question's, in the context of the changing world order and the importance of middle power nations like Australia, Japan and other Pacific trade partners in accelerating decarbonisation, could new international investment partnerships shape rapid decarbonisation? And I guess I'll add a little bit extra to that, which is how could those partnerships, what do those partnerships need to do to shape rapid decarbonisation?
Well, there's two levels here. One side, just from in terms of asset owners, there's a lot of room for collaboration around these frameworks for transition. You know, we've helped Nippon Life with its climate investment transition framework. We've done the same thing in Prudential Asia, based out of Singapore. The big asset owners are beginning to look at this, and Lacasse, OTPP, a few others are doing the same thing as well. I think there's a lot of sharing ideas and sharing knowledge and then collaborating. We see a project that the Monetary Authority of Singapore has put together called FastP, which has got investment from Nippon Life and a few others coming through, which is a specialist fund to invest in sustainable infrastructure along these routes. There's so much that we can do if we collaborate. Still got to work, because still got to meet our risk yield requirements, etc. But the thinking can be shared and needs to be shared and should be shared amongst the asset owner community. We can move much faster if we move as a herd than we move as individuals. So that's one level, if you like. The second level is about the nature of understanding the policy measures for transition. You know, we've got a bit of an understanding now, thanks to the work of the Transition Pathways Initiative, SBTI and others, about what transition needs to look like from a science perspective. The next thing is, what are the policy measures that are credible? You know, it's not just subsidies. You know, when I visit JFE Steel in Japan, they always say, give me a subsidy and I'll do it all. Actually, what's more important is a demand signal, organising large-scale contracting. If Toyota were given a tiny tax credit, it would be at a 2% tax credit to make the sums work, to buy green steel for all its Toyota fleet, JFE would have 20 years of contracts and they would build green hydrogen plants tomorrow morning around the world. These are the things that governments can help orchestrate. The European Commission in hydrogen work removes competition policy restrictions if people will come together to put together large-scale contracts around green hydrogen, as an example. So there's a bunch of policy measures that don't cost us anything, that are focused on preferencing climate transition bits of work that we need to be promoting to governments and helping governments, who, as you know, are usually swamped by short-term measures, to develop in this area. And I think that's something that we can collaborate very actively on amongst middle powers. I know already that you're talking to your colleagues in Canada. We've got a Canadian taxonomy coming through that'll draw on the Australian taxonomy, but it can also draw on policy measures, because Canada is looking at leakage in the gas industry and how to reduce leakage. It's a problem in Australia. There's so many areas of collaboration amongst the coalition of the willing that we can pursue.
Anything else from you, David, on that?
No, I think Sean answered that well.
Okay, fantastic. Nicole, the next one is for you. This is from James Mitchell, and it's focused on changes in sustainable finance frameworks that are needed to better support upstream land-based producers who carry much of the emissions and nature burden, but often face disproportionate costs and complexity in accessing sustainable finance. I'll pass that to you.
Yeah, so I think it's less about the changing frameworks, because frameworks actually enable a lot. It's really around, to David's point and a bit to Sean's point, the innovation is how we use those frameworks to be able to shore up and get the incentive stack right to support those that need it most. And so that analogy that Sean used around sort of, if you had a 2% on the demand side, so thinking about the supply chain, I think we're right in everybody thinking the solution sits necessarily with the landholder, who's the least well placed to be able to invest in those solutions and figure it all out themselves. But what are we doing further down the supply chain to create the incentivization to make that work? And so thinking about how we use these frameworks, and I know that there are financial institutions as part of the pilot that are thinking broader and deeper around, actually, how do we actually use these frameworks to create the structure so that the supply chain is driving demand for this, and that the farmers then able to respond to that in a rational economic way. And there's a lot, I think, that we can do in thinking innovatively around how we apply these frameworks so that they are better suited towards incentivizing landholders to be able to do things because it's in their economic interest to do so. So I think the job is on us to actually be innovative in the way in which we implement these things.
Thanks, Nicole. And a final audience question, which is riffing off one of the comments you made earlier, Sean, about social equality being a predictor of economic resilience. And there's a lot of evidence that says gender equality is a predictor of resilience and stability, and vice versa. Gender inequality is a predictor of conflict and instability. Would love to hear what you're seeing in terms of how gender equality is being integrated or linked to green or sustainability linked bonds or other products in the market as a way to contribute to resilience.
Not a lot yet, frankly. There's been a few attempts to do pink bonds or gender equity bonds by development banks over the years, but it's been tiny. And one of the reasons is a lack of linkage. They became niche and they weren't linked to the broader issue. If without liquidity and so on, it becomes not as attractive for investors, etc. And also the rules and guidance have been limited, if you like. We are absolutely incorporating a filter about gender issues into our resilience guidance that's coming through. We're in discussion with UN Women about making that work, because as you say, it is a predictor, as we know, of resilience. But we've got to marshal the evidence. Now, one of the things we're doing in the resilience framework is we are not making assertions. The gender bonds that came through were often caught up in assertions, even though we might have known there was a base there. We want to tease out the evidence base, make it a quantitative argument before we come to market, and link it to a large liquid universe that already exists. So portfolio managers can just simply add it to existing mandates without having to flesh out a separate mandate. That's where we're going. But you're absolutely right. It is a material issue. And, I can talk about everything from the impacts of climate change in places like Bangladesh, where 2/3 of deaths ascribed to climate impacts are female for a variety of reasons. We've got that side of things happening. On the other side of it, I can also say that financial stability in emerging markets is surprisingly linked to the primary education of women. I mean, specifically, women who have primary education start up small businesses. In microfinance, we know already that default rates amongst men is very high, about 20% default rate for microfinance loans to men. The default rate amongst women for microfinance, can you guess, Kristy?
1 to 2%,
sub 3%.
Sean.
Well, it's certainly sub 3% on average. And you're suddenly thinking, oh my God, that is financial sector resilience in a nutshell. So we're talking to central banks around this in the world. Have you thought about your agenda policy as a central bank when you're looking at financial stability? So we know all this sort of stuff. We've got to flush out. We've got to make sure that this becomes very clear to governments and, of course, investors in sovereign bonds in this particular case. A government that is investing in the primary education of women is going to lead to a government, an economy that is more financially resilient going forward, and therefore, by the way, lower default risk, et cetera, et cetera. This is where the discussion's going.
Just very quickly, Chris, because I know we're running out of time, but just sort of to this earlier point around information needs of investors. So we've had TCFD that's gone into ISSB. You've got TNFD that's now getting fully formed and starting to move into, or will be into, ISSB. And then we've got the Task Force for Social Indicators, Financial Disclosures, which is now very much underway. And so we will have, I think, within 5 years, 5 to 7 years, a more complete set of information across the spectrum of sustainability issues, including the social indicators that will help inform decision-making by investors globally.
Which is keen to give you all sort of an opportunity for final remarks as we wrap up. And I might just ask you, what are you most excited about in the next 2 to 5 years for sustainable finance? I might start with you, David, and then go to Sean and then Nicole.
The activation of the asset owner cohort, because I think they are really beginning to recognise systemic risk, and we're starting to see a series of forums in which they are really coming together, including our own. The PRI turns 20 this month, we'll be producing a report that's been authored by leading asset owners about the future of responsible investment and sustainable finance that will be coming out in coming days. And I think that sends a roadmap of demand signals that are really important for the market to recognise, because they're the capital allocators, and the capital is growing. And if you want to do business, you're going to need to understand what their needs are, and they're going to be articulating them around sustainable finance. So I think that's very exciting from my perspective.
Excellent. Sean, what about you?
Markets are recognising this. We see this in just the stable bond market, the preferential appetite happening. So it's the proof of concept is there, if you like. David's exactly right. Amongst global investors, universal owners at least, that appreciation of the broader issues involved around climate and the need to engage around it is growing. I think the next few years are going to be incredibly exciting for the sustainable finance agenda, both on a asset owner and therefore investment manager engagement side of things, and from a coalition of the willing amongst middle powers. This isn't a theoretical idea. This is actually underway. Basically, the world is going to be fixed, if you like, by a coalition of the willing. It's not going to be fixed by everyone agreeing first. And that's now beginning to shape up. And that's where Australia can play an incredibly important role if it starts thinking more aggressively, more dynamically, and looking back at its history of success in the past about how it can be a catalyst for how the world changes.
I'll be quick, Kristy. So I think never waste a crisis is the underlying theme that's coming through on this call. And I think to Sean's point, I've actually never seen an environment so ripe and so willing for collaboration. And with collaboration can come innovation. And so let's just get on with the doing and see what we can collectively come up with together.
Excellent call to action. And I think there's a big part of the coalition of the willing around sustainable finance in Australia on this call, or we'll be watching afterwards. And I think you've heard from the panel that there is huge opportunity to continue to drive progress in this area. Thank you very much, Sean, David, Nicole, for joining us. Thank you all for dialing in. As I mentioned, the recording will be available on the website afterwards if you'd like to share it with anyone, and look forward to seeing you all at an ASFI event or engagement again soon. Thanks very much.
Everyone.